This is Policy for a Circular Economy, part one. And as folks note, that no presentation these days is officially started until the technology has failed. So we will jump in and get started. So we have a terrific panel here that we've pulled together, and we're going to be digging in, both in a broad, big picture concept of what policy means for the circular economy, and Nina Butler is going to be speaking to that. And then we're going to have Sarah Peary from Senator Portman's office, author of the Recycle Act, that is going to dig into what is possible at the legislative piece, because obviously policy ideas are how you get there, but the sausage eventually does need to be made before we move it forward. So I want to dig in at first and just say, what does policy for a circular economy mean for you both? How do you think about the circular economy? And why don't we start with you, Nina?
Fundamentally, I think a circular economy takes into account all of the elements of the system. So as we function in a more capitalistic system at this point, it's understanding in really basic terms, supply and demand, and what are the drivers there. And for a healthy circular economy, we need to have things truly in balance. And in order to have the proper feedback loops that support the recovery of material and ultimately driving towards the reduction of the environmental impact that really leads to the true regeneration that we're capable of.
That's great. Thank you, Nina. Sarah, why don't you dig in a little bit? What does the circular economy mean for you? I know that we sometimes will talk very broadly, and we're talking about the circular economy in that big picture, but it's the Recycle Act kind of gets down to the more tangible, the recycling being the workhorse of the circular economy. What does policy mean for you in this sector?
Yeah, I think the circular economy means understanding the current life cycle of products and materials, and also how that life cycle could be extended or changed with reuse or recycling. So this could include anything from the efficient collection of materials so that they can be used and reused as a feedstock, making sure that those materials are processed to a quality and value that can be reused. And then also, finding the markets and consumers to resell those products. We obviously know that recycling has a number of benefits, between reducing waste that is sent to landfills or that ends up in our waterways, reducing energy use and emissions, and creating jobs. So that holistic view of the system is helpful in policy.
Sarah, something that I'm always heartened about when talking about recycling with policymakers, and is that both recycling and the circular economy are refreshingly bipartisan. You can talk to people from both sides of the aisle and get a positive response, which those topics are few and far between these days, it seems. So where do you see alignment on these topics across party lines? How are you able to work with policymakers from both parties on these issues?
Yeah, so I think there's a few examples that I'll just briefly highlight here, although I'll mention there are many members of Congress who are working on this space, so there are many others, but I'll mention two here briefly. One area of bipartisan support that Senator Portman has been particularly interested in is the need to improve education about what can be accepted into our recycling bins. To address this, he introduced the Recycle Act late last year with Senator Debbie Stabenow, the Democrat from Michigan. On the House side, Representative Dean Phillips, Democrat from Minnesota, and Dave Joyce, the Republican from Ohio. The Recycle Act is intended to help consumers and households understand what can actually go into their recycling bins instead of the term wish cycling. We've seen a lot of reports that have found that consumer confusion on how to properly recycle is one of the top recycling challenges. And obviously there's many reasons for this. One example would be some materials may be accepted in a recycling bin at home, but different materials may be accepted in the bin at work or at another family member's house. Confusion also results, for example, from some recycling labels or traditionally accepted products that may not be accepted in a particular location, or does not actually mean that they are, able to be processed at a MRF. And so by improving education, the bipartisan consensus here so far that we found is that, improving education not only aims to increase the participation in recycling, but also decreasing the contamination in the recycling stream, so that we do have higher quality, higher value products that are able to be processed and sold. And so this Recycle Act in particular creates a grant program at EPA for states, local governments, nonprofits, and public-private partnerships to provide materials and information to communities and households about what goes into the recycling bin and how to properly recycle. We have EPA setting up a toolkit for the grantees to use if they choose. And then we'd also have EPA reviewing and revising, if necessary, their comprehensive procurement guidelines, which are the designated list of products that contain recycled content. And so that's one example of bipartisan consensus on the Recycle Act in terms of education. There are others. One, for example, another would be legislation that Senator Portman is an original co-sponsor of, that was authored by Senators Whitehouse and Sullivan, which is the Save Our Seas Act. There have been two iterations of that. Primary purpose being removing waste and plastic that may already exist in our waterways, both abroad and domestically. And so, I predict that as we continue to learn about recycling, there will be many avenues for bipartisan legislation. I think what we've seen so far generally is that these bipartisan and bicameral approaches are, incremental and incentive-based, so that not one piece of legislation or not one bill is going to solve the entire problem. But the goal here is to develop legislation that can actually be signed into law, which does require, broad stakeholder support and the support from most members of Congress in order, to move the ball in the right direction.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, and I in looking at the Recycle Act, it's something that I know that the country is very hungry to work on. I actually didn't introduce myself at the opening of this presentation, but I'm Dylan DeThomas of the Recycling Partnership, and the Recycling Partnership works with communities across the country to help improve access to recycling, but also to help out with education and outreach on the very topic that the Recycle Act is attempting to put in law. And it's something that is really challenging. Someone in the chat box was mentioning, the challenges of education around recycling when it can often be different on where you live, work, and play, and there is not a silver bullet that you can wave to fix all of that, but more resources to be able to communicate more effectively with residents, whether it's at their curbside cart through cart tagging programs, or whether it's through using a graphically harmonized visual representation or communication strategy to talk to residents. All of those things can really help. So fantastic. I love that you're working on this. Nina, you've been working in the area of the circular economy for a very long time. You have a deep background in plastics recycling, but also, in that big picture sustainability space as well. What's something that you find surprising about the direction that policy conversations have moved towards? What's on the table now that you didn't think possible a few years ago?
Good question. Yeah, I've been in this space since 2000, and I really, as I got into trying to optimize programs and looking at where you have the biggest bang for your buck in terms of recovery, I think I was for many years under the illusion if we just really innovated in the space of recovery, we could really crank up our recycling rates. And when I assumed that, purchased the assets, what became really crystal clear as I started investing and understanding more of the global dynamics and basically the economics underpinning recycling, And that was an interesting time as we were transitioning and really moving into this space of a new domination of energy from the United States to the global marketplace. Going into the basics of economics, if we externalize costs on one side and we we externalize costs and subsidize, we have made it fundamentally difficult to really move in the right direction. So what surprises me at this point is that as I'm working with various companies throughout the entire value chain, from petrochem to trade associations, I think the reality, as those who really understand the system are coming to terms with the need for policy that puts true value on our resources, that addresses the carbon problem as the plastic waste problem, as well as paper waste, are all inextricably linked. What gives me hope is I think that people that really understand the system recognize that we need very big systemic policy changes that start to really move towards value and transparency.
That's terrific, Nina. Thank you. You know, I too just think about just the conversations around recycling. You know, for years it was challenging to even have a conversation with policymakers, and now it's there are a lot of policy ideas out there, which is great because it helps put that focus on both recycling and the circular economy, but also gives me hope that something will actually pass, which is great. So, you know, speaking of getting something passed, you know, and when you are looking at policy solutions, and this is a question to both of us, let's talk about unintended consequences. What's a pitfall that you hope to avoid when looking at a policy proposal around the topic of the circular economy? And Nina, whenever you want me to share your slide, you just let me know. We're not texting, so I'll just bring that up. So, okay. Sarah, why don't you talk about unintended consequences first?
Okay, sure, happy to. I think first and foremost, you know, when we look at policy ideas or proposals, we want to make sure we're not doing it in sort of the Washington bubble, right? So that we're talking to a wide group of stakeholders that understand how the policy would actually work and be implemented on the ground. And frankly, that's why I have enjoyed participating in these types of events and others to meet, you know, experts in the space so that, you know, we as a staff member can have an understanding on the ground from the actual experts. So I think that's sort of what underpins not just, you know, this, but really any policy proposal. Specifically when it comes to the recycling topic, I mean, I think there are a number of things that we want to keep in mind. You know, obviously we don't want to create policies that inadvertently, you know, stifle innovation. Our country's innovation and technological advancements have been able to help us find solutions for a lot of modern day problems. We don't want to, you know, inadvertently discourage or remove that innovation or ingenuity. I think the other thing that's really unique about the recycling space is that it is very decentralized. And so there should be a recognition that the current markets and the industry itself is regional, and that we need to make sure that, you know, we understand that certain policy proposals may work better in one area of the country better than others, just because they all face, you know, unique challenges and differences. And then finally, you know, I often remind myself that, you know, the recycling system is very interconnected and constantly changing. And I think that's why it's important that we need to understand the full life cycle of products, from, you know, anything from what it takes to make them to how they're used to the benefits of being able to reuse or remake them, in order to evaluate the benefits or impact of policies. And then on the constantly changing side, I mean, we've seen the impacts of China's sword policy on the U.S. industry, but also, you know, the adjustments that are in some ways underway already. We've also seen these changes in terms of, you know, industry changing with consumer preferences as consumers are, you know, demanding more sustainability. You know, companies are increasingly making commitments to source their products from, you know, increasing percentages of recycled content. So I think recognizing those things will help us not just look at this as one snapshot, in time, but more of a continuum that may require, several different flexible approaches to policy that will improve this system.
Yeah, that's you brought up that recycling isn't just one thing. It's we often at the partnership talk about it really being a loosely connected, highly interdependent series of industries that work together to make something go. I always think of an unintended consequence when sometimes people say, well, like there was a comment earlier in the chat box of like, well, why can't we recycle all the same thing in the same place? And if you launched a list that was the same accepted materials all around the country, you wouldn't be able to capture a lot of materials because of the variability of markets, because of the incredible geographic diversity of our country. It can be really challenging, and there is not one silver bullet that will solve everything that touches recycling or the circular economy. All of these things need to work together, to be able to level up the system, to be able to make that intervention work for it. Nina, what do you think? What are some unintended consequences? What's a pitfall that you look at, or maybe you can kind of talk about the interconnectivity of sustainability and recycling, and the paradoxes therein.
Yeah, this is something I tried to really drive in as I testified in June for the U.S. Senate. And the key point for me is to stay focused on the North Star policy, which is we have to address the carbon problem, and the plastic waste and waste in general problem is inextricably linked to that problem. So what we see playing out, because as humans we're more focused on what we can see and maybe the things that might be more of a risk to us. So we are very focused on the plastic waste problem because it's one of the very top issues to address, as particularly in this generation. But the paradox issue with plastics is that as we switch to something else as an alternative to that material, as we look at bans, without changing consumption patterns, we could quadruple the environmental impact of a lot of our actions, a lot of our consumption patterns. So that's why I think moving forward, to look at it just on a diversion or just on a pounds recovered basis without looking at the full life cycle, where we know that most of the impact of a product happens well before it reaches the consumer, and then certainly the small portion is what happens to it at its end of life. So what gives me hope, what I'm worried about not addressing sooner than later, though, is that if we don't define that North Star policy and unlock innovation towards that, we're going to probably have a lot more environmental impact along this hiccup towards trying to increase recycling rates and reduce waste.
What are some bumps in the road? I'd love to hear more about that, Nina. And I heartily recommend anyone who is on this panel to seek out that Senate Environmental Committee hearing that you spoke at. It was a really, really great committee meeting, and also just again speaks to the level of engagement that we've seen in policymakers. What are some other points that you raised during that hearing, kind of thinking broadly?
I think it's to look at how we make incremental change without acknowledging what we're facing in terms of our company tracks how much gets collected for recycling in North America for plastic, the non-bottle rigid, bottles, film. And the reality is we have been fighting. The good news is that domestic purchasing has gone up the last couple of years, despite looking at the drop in demand from export markets. It just hasn't been enough to offset that. So the reality is we're moving in the wrong direction, and that needs to be fully acknowledged. And why is it moving in the wrong direction? It's easy to look at the narrative of, well, China went away, but we weren't preparing for China going away. And, I have warnings from 2004 talking about that. Mm-hmm. So to look at what are the economic drivers right now that are making it really difficult for us to handle our own material. One really basic thing that I pointed out is if you take the largest category of plastic, the olefins, which include high-density polyethylene, polypropylene, low-density polyethylene, you take the top 10 virgin resin producers, we only have less than 5% of the domestic reclamation capacity compared to those top 10 virgin resin producers. There is a massive delta in terms of the actual capacity to reclaim versus virgin production. So we have a trickle of recycling compared to a tsunami of new virgin production. So we need to make these investments, certainly, and we need better education. We need consumers to be engaged, but we also need to look at how to close that huge delta, and that gets into the economic fundamentals that need to be addressed.
Thank you, Nina. So, I want to dig in a little bit too on, on how that translates into policy, policy moves. I think that we're sometimes challenged as to something that can work across party lines to be able to have that conversation. Sarah, I would love to hear how how you and your office have worked with other policymakers to have those broader conversations, to be able to bring people to the same table. And I think there was, for instance, there was a conflation in the chat box between the Recycle Act and the Recover Act. The Recover Act is is an infusion of capital for grants to recycling programs, whereas the Recycle Act is more targeted around education. I'd love to see how those conversations start, Sarah, as you're working again. You're working with your colleagues throughout the the halls, that big building on the Hill.
Sure. Well, I will start by reiterating that these conversations start with having meetings and learning about this issue from, I assume, many of you that are listening in to this panel. Actually, it's staff learning from those on the ground who are experiencing these problems that we even recognize what the issues are. And so that's sort of how we start to form the policy. I mean, we were looking at the reports that were showing that consumer confusion, for example, was a big barrier in having recycled material collected properly, and having such high contamination rates when the material does get to the MRF. And so that's why we looked to address the education question. We're also, in terms of the Recover Act, there are some differences. Obviously, the Recover Act also deals with recycling infrastructure, which is something that Senator Portman is also interested in. So looking at, learning about what the China sword policy has done to the U.S. industry. I mean, for one, you start asking questions about what we're doing to handle, the increased volumes of materials and the types of materials, and you're asking questions about our recycling infrastructure today and whether it's equipped to handle different types of materials and the volume, and to process it at the value that is able to allow this material to be reused. And so I think learning from many of you on the line and many others that about the system and about the challenges helps us to sort of pick out the issues that we feel like the federal government plays an appropriate role in helping or addressing.
That's terrific. Yeah, that's a key point. Yet, recycling, and I often, when I'm speaking about recycling to folks, I often bring up the fact that you don't get the environmental benefits of recycling when you collect the material or when you process the material. It's when it displaces virgin material going into new products is when you see that. And so, to that end, end market demand is critically important, and getting that clean feedstock, again, raising that education piece as well is incredibly important. It doesn't happen without that. There are a couple of questions in the chat box about procurement and how procurement can help end markets. Nina, why don't you speak to that first, and then I'll kind of follow up and talk a little bit about demand myself. So go ahead. What are some things that come to mind when that question is raised?
Well, yeah, considering that we have Sarah, joining us. I think what's really important is there is a great opportunity with the federal government in terms of defining what are the standards and measures and creating that transparency in the marketplace so that companies that are making these major investments right now to move into circularity receive a competitive advantage. I think that's just fundamental to any strong economic system. So I do think that needs to happen through policy and through investment at the federal level. We as a company are really trying to create that transparency and stimulate the balance of supply and demand just through the tools that we make available. And I think what gives me a lot of hope is we know as a society had to do some incredible technology in terms of traceability, looking at the whole supply chain, distribution of materials, but we haven't applied that to the reverse logistics. And that's where, again, at a federal level, if there was value placed on material, we could figure out how to get it back. I have total faith in, from the Amazons and all of the big tech, we could figure this out.
Well,
so yeah, I encourage.
Oh, go ahead, Nina.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so circularity in action is one place we're trying to hold tools that support the circular economy from not just our company, but other organizations as well, and create that transparency, help companies find supplies of feedstock, and help consumers find products with recycled content.
That's a great point. I even hovered my mouse over it. I know we're not the only video everybody is seeing, unfortunately, is just me. Sorry about that. And currently, integrating that material into products is again really important, whether it's on a personal level, making sure you're buying materials that have recycled content. I'm looking at a box of tissues on my desk that has recycled content in it, or via procurement, whether that be at the governmental level. There's a number of states that have procurement guidelines, and as Sarah had mentioned, there's a piece to the Recycle Act that addresses that as well. There's also voluntary programs. The Association of Plastic Recyclers has their Recycling Demand Champions program that allows companies to voluntarily sign up to be able to increase their intake of recycled content to go into works in process, which is to say, like things that are in industrial processes like pallets or slip sheets or trash cans or recycling carts or speed bumps. And you can put recycled plastics in those, especially polyolefins, which are polypropylene and high density polyethylene. And that program, though voluntary, has increased the consumption by millions of pounds of recycled content, which is great. I think that there's a real balance there of what is, that broader vision and then what's possible. And I think that, being able to bridge that and how the policy interacts is really incredibly important. Not one solution works everywhere, and not one solution works for everything. So, as we reach the end of our policy conversation, what gives you both optimism about the future moving forward? Oh, and I'm sorry, I should have told one of you to speak. Sarah, why don't you start?
Sure. So, I think I have certainly, learned a lot about recycling and the circular economy over, a short period of time. And I've been, really heartened to see the amount of stakeholders that are interested and involved, diverse group of stakeholders from many different spectrums of the industry. And, a lot of folks agree that, something needs to be done. And that's a great place to start when there's a recognition that, something needs to be done. And then it's the question of, finding common ground on what can actually get signed into law. And so to have that avenue and opportunity of folks willing to talk about it and educate us and find those pieces is great.
And before you go, Nina, I just wanted to say, somebody had asked, like, what bills are there out there? Is the Recycle Act, as we've mentioned a number of times, the Break Free from Plastics Act, there's Save Our Seas 2.0, there's the Recover Act. So there is a great deal of federal interest in this space. So just wanted to put that out there. Nina, why don't you tell us what gives you optimism about the future of the circular economy and policy moving forward?
Yeah, I agree with what Sarah said. I think what gives me hope, and I think to acknowledge where we are at this historic time, with a pandemic, with what's happening on a equity level across society right now, we have this huge opportunity to recognize the need for balancing across our entire system. That's from a health perspective, to a social perspective, to an economic perspective. And I think we're finally having this conversation, being grounded and having to look at what are the resources we can lean on locally. It's one of the most important possible things we can do. How do we look at our own system as opposed to, I can make a case for using plastic if we're shipping stuff across thousands of miles. And we need to preserve all of the food that we have so we're not leading to more food waste and greenhouse gas emissions. But how we look at it through the lens of our local economy and creating jobs, and what those leaders that I think are emerging at the federal and regional level that are looking at what is the stimulus package that will really catapult us into a regenerative next era type of society is what really gives me hope.
That's great. I think what gives me hope is that there is such interest. I always, when I talk to people, sometimes they're surprised to find that there is not a national recycling policy, that we essentially just look at, how to throw things in the ground. That's the regulation that we have. And I think that it's incredibly important, and I think possible that something could happen on the federal level to be able to help level up the recycling system, to be able to put the infrastructure in place, the carts, the trucks, the MRFs, the sortation facilities, to be able to collect recycling. So where I am in Portland, Oregon, and where Nina is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Sarah is in Washington, D.C., where we get our recycling automatically with our trash, that happens in the rest of the country as well, in big cities and small, to make sure that we make it as easy to recycle something as it is to throw it away. And as Nina points out, incredibly critically importantly, to make sure that there's the end markets to be able to, Nina and Sarah brought this up, to be able to consume that material once it's recycled right and put back into the circular economy. And I believe that's the end of our panel. So I'm going to look to Taylor, our organizer, to be able to close up. I think you bop into another room, and we'll have part 2 in just another moment. So it's a great pleasure. Thank you so much for having us. And I want to thank my panelists, Nina Butler from More Recycling and Sarah Peary from Senator Portman's office. I've been Dylan DeThomas with the Recycling Partnership. Thank you so much, and have a great day. I'll see you in the next panel. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Don.